Good morning. If you attend a lecture about Bloemfontein, then this place is probably close to your heart already. Either that or you were forced by lecturers, an insatiable curiosity, or circumstances beyond your control to endure it. You may be in dire need of CPD points, or maybe you are at the wrong venue altogether. Bloemfontein is a place easily taken for granted. In 1911, a former inhabitant described it as the dorpiest dorp in the Union. Counterintuitively, it is exactly the way Bloemfontein is often overlooked, which provides a good reason to see this small city as a place of consequence. In the words of the German philosopher Martin Heidegger, and don't worry, I won't be talking too much about him today, what is ontically nearest and familiar is ontologically the farthest, unrecognized, and constantly overlooked in its ontological significance. Indeed, the unsung everydayness of Bloemfontein harbors deep lessons about that which is nearest. The Norwegian architect and theorist Christian Norberg Schultz, and this is also the last mention, ascribed great importance to the everyday figure of speech, life takes place. He saw it as confirmation of the intertwined nature of our lives and the places we inhabit. And yes, on the one hand, our places, even Bloemfontein, as a concrete lived spatiality, point toward that which is nearest. But what exactly draws life and place into nearness? The aim of this lecture is threefold. Firstly, it is meant as an introduction to the small city, which serves as the background to the Sophia Gray lecture Hendrik Auret will be presenting tonight. Secondly, I will present a series of maps that trace the development of Bloemfontein and contrast the stories of President Brand Street and the Viaduct location. And thirdly, I will reflect on the capacity of these maps to draw close to that which is nearest. Before I go any further, I would like to acknowledge the following persons and institutions for their help in researching and preparing this series of maps. I would like to single out Hendrik Auret and Madeleine Gerber for the vast amount of time I was allowed to spend compiling these maps. As an output of Auret Architects, these maps also form part of the exhibition at Olivenhuis. My research has taken me to dusty places. Maps were principally sourced from the Free State Provincial Archive Repository, the National Museum, the Fire Station Museum, and the Mangaung Metropolitan Municipality. I also refer to the study by W.F.S. Senekal, in which he mapped land uses in Bloemfontein between 1900 and 1970. If you look closely at the maps I'm presenting, then you will see that various land uses are indicated, but I won't really have time to go into that today. While the original maps are wonderful documents, they do present a set of drawbacks. The maps are often not on the same scale, which hinders comparison. They are kept in different locations, and some of the maps, especially the oldest ones, paid very little attention to the surrounding context. Specifically, the 1936 aerial photograph and the 1971 traced map were composed by amalgamating various small maps or photos. In the case of the 1936 map, 108 photographs taken along a somewhat erratic flight paths between October 1935 and January 1936. And in the case of the 1971 map, I used 20 of the 64 maps traced from aerial surveys of Bloemfontein during 1971 in order to make the composite map. Now, this is not the first attempt to do such a series of maps. Besides the maps of Senekal, there are also a series by Kobus de Pre and Dr. Jan van der Westhuizen that I'm aware of. All maps flirt in different ways with the fine line between inclusivity and clarity. There is only so much information one can present on a map. I hope I have chosen wisely. The first map shows Bloemfontein as a pinprick of civilization within the expanse of the Free State landscape. Bloemfontein was founded in 1846 by Major Henry Douglas Warden on the farm of Johann Nicolaas Brits. The Sotho called the place Mangaung, the place of the leopard. Warden settled on the same piece of land occupied by Brits, a site that today houses the presidency in President Brand Street. Now, there are four key topographical elements that I want to point out at the start. Naval Hill, Signal Hill, Fort Hill in the south, and the Dolerite Ridge extending between them. This Dolerite Ridge created a natural barrier to the water draining from the west and resulted in a flay. The pressure that built up in the semi-dammed area fed the original Bloemfontein, the Bloemfontein, literally, that drained through a narrow gap in the Dolerite Ridge and flowed eastward as Bloemspruit. The ridge also constituted the backbone of Bloemfontein's defense strategy, and all three forts were built along it. The first, with the goal of protecting the fountain, was built in 1846 and was called Fort Drury. The second, built in 1849, relied on the much more secure location at the top of Fort Hill. This fort was named Queen's Fort and is currently used as a military museum. Shortly before the outbreak of the Anglo-Boer South African War, there was an attempt to build a fort on the top of Signal Hill, but eventually only the road to the fort and the foundations was completed. The point is that an inside was created, a place in which, as Gaston Bachelard put it, people may dwell as half-open being, as simultaneously visible and hidden. If we zoom in, we can see that the street orientation was determined by the general flow of Bloemspruit. Indeed, the early history of Bloemfontein is a story intimately connected with the availability of water. Interestingly, this arrangement resulted in what can only be described as a fortuitous cardodecumanus. In the oil painting of 1851 by Thomas Baines, we see Bloemfontein in these early years, a precarious aggregation of small homesteads nestled between that which we in the Free State sometimes call mountains. From this story of water and hills, we move to the 1850s. Initially, Bloemfontein experienced a short burst of growth as people from the surroundings investigated the potential of building a future there. However, we can see clearly that Bloemfontein is still within this topographical inside. If we zoom in, one sees the presence at Queen's Fort, or the military presence at Queen's Fort, and various other military functions at the foot of Fort Hill. Another important development is the setting out of the Market Square, which is today known as Hofman Square. The square is dissected by the new access created by Church Street, leading to the first Dutch Reformed church. What started as a fortuitous cardodecumanus has now been made explicit within the settlement pattern. For the time being, Church Street extended only as far as the military camp at the foot of Fort Hill. If we zoom in even further, we can see a water channel to the south of the Spruit that runs parallel to it. Originally, Brits dug this channel to his house. After Warden arrived, Brits extended the channel to a military water tank on the corner of, that stood on the corner of St. George and East Burger Street. From this panorama taken in 1866 by Charles Hamilton, we can see that Bloemfontein now had a more settled air about it. The church and the Market Square being on the north-south institutional axis and the residential east-west axis of the Watererwe along Bloemspruit. Between 1850 and 1880, the Free State became a Boer Republic. It is a moment of civic pride that can be told as a story of 3 squares, 3 towers, and 1 monument. Generally, the settlement is hesitantly extending to, and in some cases, reaching beyond the edge of the inside. In 1871, the Basotho War Memorial was erected on the top of Fort Hill, and in 1873, Church Street was also extended to the top of the hill. However, when one looks at the route indicated on the 1890 Weilande plan, then it becomes clear that Church Street was still not the iconic entrance that it later became. Instead, when people neared Bloemfontein from the south, they either entered through Bastion Square on the eastern side of Fort Hill or President Square on the west. If we zoom in, we see the 3 main squares, Warden, Market Square, and Bauman Square. The 3 towers refer to the 2 of the Tweetoring or Twin Spire Church, which was finished in 1880, and the tower of the government building, which was finished in 1876. Between the Tweetorenkerk and the Basotho War Memorial, the north-south axis has been transformed into a dignified vista. But there is another north-south route that starts gaining prominence during this time. The choice to construct the government building in this street and the construction projects completed in the following years would later transform President Brand Street into the most significant north-south axis. Also notice the town dam in the vicinity of what is today Parkweg Station. Significantly, this is the first map in which we also see Waihoek. Waihoek was a native location that sprung up east of Fort Hill and was referred to already in 1864. In 1880, we can already see a formal layout taking shape. Since the interaction between Waihoek and President Brand Street plays an important role in the background of Anton's lecture tonight, I would like to take a closer look at these two contrasting stories. On the 1880 map, President Brand Street has not been extended beyond the Spruit, and already we see that the northern culmination is sort of odd. I should point out that President Brand Street, just like Waihoek, was very much at the outskirts of Bloemfontein. Even by 1893, one can hardly say that President Brand Street is defined by a dense built layout. However, one can also see the seeds of the institutional axis we know today. The government building, today Nullen, the presidency, completed in 1886, and the fourth Raadsaal, completed in 1893. And in the hazy distance, as always on old photographs of Bloemfontein, Waihoek. Bloemfontein was still a small town within the surrounding expanse, but it was also a town that would soon lose its innocence. The Anglo-Boer South African War placed Bloemfontein at the center of one of the most devastating periods in this country's history. It was a war that had an immediate influence on Bloemfontein. From 1880 to 1904, we see that Bloemfontein had ventured far beyond the inside that used to confine it. After the war, the British garrison was stationed at Tempe, which created a great influx of people, and there were also many who fled the wartime devastation of farms and sought new life in the city. If we zoom in, we see that the three squares and the north-south axis of the Republican city has remained, but we also see that the arrival of the railroad in 1890 and the building of the railway station at the eastern end of Maitland Street created a strong east-west axis. In fact, we seem to have a general tendency in Bloemfontein to end our spatial axes in institutions, as if in this expansive landscape the need to create insides endured in our urban planning. Other examples include Gordon or West Burger Street, culminating in the Anglican Cathedral, Green or Olival Street, culminating in the Roman Catholic Church, East Burger Street leading up to the fort, and President Brand Street being hemmed in by Somerset House in the north and the asylum in the south. Despite these man-made interventions, one of the greatest changes to Bloemfontein's urban fabric was caused by a natural disaster. On 17 January 1904, Bloemspruit flooded its banks and destroyed a large portion of downtown Bloemfontein. During the flood, the narrow opening through which the Bloemspruit used to flow was substantially widened and deepened. The result was that the natural barrier that used to dam the flow was punctured and that the water table in these western areas were lowered. This made the development of Park West and the extension of Park Road much more feasible. By 1900, President Brand Street was more densely populated, and at the north end, it culminated in Somerset House. If we return to our comparison between President Brand Street and Waihoek, we see the addition of the asylum in the south, today the Free State Psychiatric Complex, and Somerset House in the north. In 1893, a statue of President Brand was erected in the middle of the road, and we have already talked about President Square. In Waihoek, the 6 initial blocks have expanded substantially. Significantly, Waihoek found itself on the right side of the tracks. In fact, there was only a street between Waihoek and Bloemfontein. But that was much too close. Already, one can see that the transition between Waihoek and Bloemfontein, hemmed in by the fort and the railway, was being funneled even further. Due to the flood of 1904, the decision was taken to canalize Bloemspruit, and those in charge decided that the best place for a quarry was on the front porch of Waihoek. There are stories of people in Waihoek who had boulders coming through their roofs due to the blasting activities at the quarry, and in a sense, a natural disaster therefore served as an excuse for a human disaster and began the steady demise of Waihoek. The bottom photograph shows the transition between Bloemfontein and Waihoek in 1892. The middle photograph shows the quarry separating Bloemfontein from the expanding Waihoek circa 1906, and the top photograph shows quarry activities with the houses of Waihoek in the background. From 1904 to 1912, Bloemfontein experienced rapid growth. The central district of what was now the judicial capital of the Union of South Africa was surrounded by a series of large land users that served as catalyst for residential expansion. Tempe, Grey College, the horse racing track, Kings Park, the asylum, and the agricultural showgrounds. At this time, we'll also see the area identified for the National Women's Memorial, where we will be having a picnic later today. Queen's Fort and the railway grounds to the east, and Naval Hill and Signal Hill towards the north completed the new enclosure. If we zoom in, then we basically see the same layout as in 1904, except for the fact that Warden Square has been filled with a library and a museum, and that the Arthur Nathan swimming pool was constructed at the northern end of East Burger Street. You can also see that the access of St. Andrew Street has been extended as Kingsway through Kings Park all the way to the main building of what would become the University of the Free State. In President Brand Street, there is the addition of the High Court in 1906, and the government building, which burnt down in 1908, was rebuilt with the tower even higher than before. Today we know it as Nullen. In Waihoek, there is a second quarry north of the original, but at this time I would also like to mention the three influential churches of Waihoek. St. Philip's Church and School was built in the 1890s, St. Patrick's Church, on which construction was started in 1908, and the Wesleyan Church and School, which was completed in 1904. It was in the school building of the Wesleyan Church that on 9 or 8 January 1912, the ANC was formed. The fact that for many years this was a forgotten piece of information has probably contributed to the miraculous survival of this building. It is probably the only building of what was once Waihoek that has survived. Here's one of the few photographs of Waihoek at its peak. In the foreground is St. Philip's Church, and on the lower left-hand corner, you can see the side of the first quarry. In the following years, the systematic destruction of Waihoek started in earnest. In 1924, 3 of the original 6 blocks of Waihoek were demolished in order to construct a power station. Waihoek was being gradually dismantled. No further building work was allowed, and any new additions were immediately demolished. When owners died or decided to sell their homes to the municipality, these homes were also demolished. In 1941, the last inhabitants of Waihoek was relocated to Bartow on the other side of the tracks. Already in this 1935 map, the intentions of the authorities seemed clear. They would wipe Waihoek from history. When we move from the 1912 map to the 1936 aerial photograph of Bloemfontein, one can easily discern the old urban structures with, of course, the loss of Bowman Square as well. If we zoom in, and then zoom in even further, we see that the early Carlo de Camanus of Church and Maitland Street and the institutional access of President Brand Street is still very prominent. However, the thing that struck me most about the 1936 Bloemfontein are the gardens. From the splendor that King's Park must have been in the upper left-hand corner, to the various institutional gardens, to the many private gardens, Bloemfontein was interspersed with a wide array of geometric botanical wonder, which makes the fate of Vryhoek all the more cruel. In President Brand Street, the appeal court is added in 1929, the fire station in 1933, and the city hall in 1936. This photograph was taken during the construction of the city hall and shows the institutional splendor of President Brand Street. Notice also that President Brand's statue, which used to stand in the middle of the road, has been moved to the side of the road in order to accommodate the tram lines. In Vryhoek, the systematic destruction is evident, and the situation would continue to deteriorate. In 1953, St. Patrick's Church was demolished in order to make way for a cooling tower, and in the next photograph, one can see the Vryhoek Church and school being converted into businesses. To add insult to injury, Vryhoek was replaced with what one can describe as a new classical Beaux-Arts urban layout. And yes, Rhodes Avenue cuts through the center of it. From 1936 to 1971, there is continued development and expansion. It is important to note that during this time, we see a further eastward shift in the institutional center of the town towards Margraaf Street, with buildings like the Haai Vervoerd building, the Civic Theatre, and the Free State Stadium. In the following years, there would also be the Bram Fischer building, the C.R. Swart building, and the Saint du Plessis Theatre. In President Brand Street, another government building is added along with Hertzog Square to the north of the 4th Raadsaal. Unfortunately, with the demolishment of Somerset House, the opportunity to provide President Brand Street with a fitting culmination was missed. Instead, we got a strangely curving road and a couple of one-ways. From 1971 to 2015, we unfortunately see the systematic weakening and dissolution of the old urban fabric and ordering systems at the hands of market forces and traffic efficiencies. Green space is decimated in the name of progress, and suburbs seeking solace in ever more far-flung gated locations. On the positive side, there are many efforts at reintegrating that which was once forcibly separated. In Vryhoek, the Wesleyan School has been restored, and other projects like the statue of Nelson Mandela and the surrounding park on Naval Hill offer scant but bright glimpses of how we may be able to reclaim lost things. While President Brand Street is still without a meaningful northern culmination, there have been appropriate additions like the new building for the Department of Public Works. However, it seems clear to me that we live in a city which often fails to think creatively when it comes to matters of heritage. For instance, the fragmentation and systematic destruction of King's Park. Already we have built up 2/3 of it, and one shudders to think of the office blocks / shopping mall that will probably cover the area once the zoo is moved to the outskirts of town, even if it has upturned cows. Or the fragmentation of Ramblers Club. While it probably sounded like a good deal, it represents an unfortunate cycle which has played itself out many times before. In the end, the old building always has to go. We are still doing it. Just last month, the Reformed Church on the corner of Zaston Street and West Burger was demolished. Or think about the moving of the Basotho War Memorial from where it proudly stood etched against the sky at the top of Church Street to an obscure overgrown patch next to the fort. Or even the dissolution of the St. Andrew's Kingsway access. A road closed, a mall extended, a roadway made more efficient. But when you think about what we lost, it all seems a bit dispiriting. But that, I guess, is the point I'm trying to make. On the one hand, this series of maps traces a temporal progression that very precisely portrays what has happened in this small city. But they are also complete illusions. These maps draw us close to the place, as a progression of what Norbert Schultz understood, understood as continuity and change, a guiding spirit that endures amid changes. Simultaneously, there are a million moments of mortal ecstasy, foolishness, creativity, and desperation, choices upon concerns which these maps can never portray. Acknowledging these moments grants insight into our lived care, the way we appreciate our places in unique and indecipherable ways. On the other hand, continuity and change helps us to recognize the enduring topological order, light quality, and heritage that explains the concrete reality of our places. On the one side, history, and on the other, what Heidegger called, called our historicity. Instead of viewing these maps as a series constituted through continuity and change, it is as if we need to look into these maps in order to see the mortal engaged in moments of significance. I want to return to the question about that which is nearest. The fact that we do appreciate our places implies that we are somehow open or predisposed towards such a meaningful relationship. The way in which we draw close to places, the ways in which places matter to us, the fact that lost opportunities in Bloemfontein can dispirit us. These are instances which reveal ourselves as beings of care or sorge, as in our capacity to care as well as the way in which we are fundamentally concerned about our existence. Care makes something like history, memory, and meaning accessible to us. I believe it is best to think of our spatio-temporal existence as a life-care place totality, a situation in which lived space is best understood as place and lived time is best understood as care. This kind of thinking leaves room for the continuity and change of concrete places between earth and sky, the concerned ecstatic moments of mortal life between birth and death and divine, and the way in which we ultimately appropriate places as regions of concern. This is why I think it is very fitting that we speak in Afrikaans of our environment as an omgewing, literally that lived reality which is my concern. It is care that draws life and place into contiguity. In the end, it is this life-care-place totality which is nearest. Under the spell of that which is nearest, life becomes most real when saturated with our care, and place becomes most meaningful as a region of concern. One can see this in the way the early maps of Bloemfontein are filled with stories of water, the role of the military in the following years, the civic pride, and the need for ordering during the Boer Republic, the cultivation of gardens amid destruction, and we may be wearied by the larger forces of efficiency that seem to have such a firm grip on our current reality. Human life takes place as care in a place delimited by care. Works of architecture have the capacity and obligation to carefully shelter and dignify our emplaced concern. Of course, there are economic, political, material, and technical constraints, but fundamentally, building is an act of care which happens within a region of concern. Amid the precariousness and poetics of mortal being in the world, works of architecture manifest the concerned and careful building of that which is nearest. I thank you.